Here at EMFX Studios, we're all kind of just a bunch of nerds coming together to make content. While we're all obviously stoked about things like video games, movies, comic books, we also love the sometimes overlooked nerd pastime of board games. What's great about board games is that they're tons of fun, they get you and your buddies together, and they tell a story. From the box art, to the shape of the pieces, to what happens in-game while you're playing. Here on our channel, we're going to share with you the stories we make while playing board games in a new, conveniently named series, Board Game Wednesdays. Each week, we'll cover a round of whatever game we're playing, showing you the moves made, getting inside the minds of the players, and maybe showing a little bit of the off-board shenanigans that happen whenever you sit down to play. For our pilot series on this new show, we're going to play a personal favorite of mine, Axis and Allies 1942 2nd Edition. Let's take a look at round one and see who will conquer the board, Axis or Allies.
Spring 1942. The Axis powers of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan are at war with the Allied powers of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States of America. The Axis seek to take dominance over the majority of the world, with the Allied powers standing against them. In order for either side to achieve their goal, they must take control of various victory cities across the globe, of which there are 13. The Axis need to control 10, 2 of which being Berlin and Tokyo, and 1 being an Allied capital in order to win. The Allies, on the other hand, need 12 victory cities, at least 1 being an Axis capital, to achieve victory. The Allies currently control 7 of the 13. The Soviet Union controls Moscow and Leningrad, the British Empire controls London and Calcutta, and the United States controls Washington, San Francisco, and Honolulu. The Axis control the remaining 6, with Germany controlling Berlin, Rome, and Paris, and Japan controlling Tokyo, Shanghai, and Manila. The Axis plan is to first focus on knocking Russia out of the war before turning their attention to the Western Allies. Germany will do the bulk of the fighting in this theater. Attempting a pincer maneuver, Germany will focus on capturing Karelia SSR and the Caucasus, taking control of Leningrad as well as 2 Soviet factories in the process. Their armies will then attack Russia from the north, south, and west. While the offensive on the Eastern Front is taking place, the German Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe will keep the American and Royal Navies at bay, while the Afrika Korps does its best to maintain a foothold in North Africa, being continually reinforced from Italy. In East Asia, the Japanese plan for a 3-pronged offensive, all with the ultimate goal of putting pressure on the USSR. One army will advance across the Soviet-Manchuria border, while another will be tasked with destroying the US-backed Chinese forces, pushing into the Soviet territories bordering China. Finally, in South Asia, the Japanese will concentrate on taking India, using the factory there to deploy units that will attack the Caucasus. While the Imperial Japanese Army, or IJA, fight across Asia, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, will patrol their island and coastal territories, preventing the United States from mounting any effective naval campaigns until the Soviets are dealt with, and the full weight of the Japanese military can be brought against the West. The Allies have a plan of their own. The Allies will undertake a Germany-first strategy, dumping the bulk of their resources into defeating Germany first, before turning their attention to the Japanese. Anticipating a Soviet-first approach from the Axis, the Allies intend to use the Soviet Union as a punching bag of sorts, tying up German and Japanese units while the Western Allies take control of the Atlantic and begin ferrying troops into Europe. The combined forces of the Allied powers should prove too much for Germany, and it will collapse. In the Pacific, the UK will tie up the Japanese for as long as possible by continuously deploying units to India, while the US will attempt to break the IJN into smaller forces that can be defeated in detail, simultaneously deploying small expeditionary forces to retake Japanese territories. Axis and Allies is played in rounds. Each round is broken up into 5 turns, 1 for each global power. This video will cover the first round of this playthrough. With the opening move of the game, the Soviets intend to push the German front away from Moscow and the Caucasus, protecting both their capital and 2 of their factories by pushing into West Russia and Ukraine SSR. First, the Soviets will pick their build. With 24 IPCs at their disposal, the USSR will build 8 infantry. Now on their attack move, the Soviets send 4 infantry and 1 artillery from Russia, 1 infantry and 1 tank from Archangel, and 3 infantry and 1 artillery from Karelia SSR into West Russia, defended by 3 German infantry, 1 artillery, and 1 tank. The Soviets also send 3 infantry, 1 artillery, and 1 tank from the Caucasus, 2 tanks and 1 fighter from Russia, and 1 fighter from Karelia into Ukraine SSR, which is defended by 3 German infantry, 1 artillery, 1 tank, and 1 fighter. In West Russia, the Soviets scored 4 hits on their first roll, while Germany only managed to score 1. The second round finished off the remaining German armor, but not without a fight. By the end, 6 Soviet infantry, 2 artillery, and 1 Soviet tank were left to occupy West Russia. In the Ukraine, Soviet forces once again hit hard, scoring 4 hits on their first roll, with Germany once again only scoring 1. The second roll eliminated the remaining German units, with only 1 additional Soviet loss in return. The USSR now controlled Ukraine with 1 infantry, 1 artillery, and 3 tanks. In the non-combat phase, the Soviets flew the 2 fighters involved in the attack on Ukraine back to Russia. The submarine in Sea Zone 4 sailed to Sea Zone 7, reinforcing the Royal Navy in the area. A temporary buffer against the Japanese was needed. The infantry from Novosibirsk, Kazakh SSR, and Evenki National Okrug were deployed to Xinjiang to protect their border with China, while the infantry in Buryatia SSR and the Soviet Far East were retreated to Yakut SSR. This was done to prevent the infantry from being hit by naval bombardment, forcing the Japanese to bring their armies inland to attack them. With no more movements planned, the Soviets mobilized their build. 2 infantry were deployed from the factory in Karelia, 2 from the factory in Russia, and 4 from the factory in the Caucasus. Now at the end of their turn, the Soviets collected their income. Having captured Ukraine and West Russia, both with an IPC count of 2, and still having full control of their original territory, the USSR collected 28 IPCs. Following the Soviets, the Germans found themselves in a slight predicament at the start of their first turn. Their forward defenders had proved nowhere near as effective as desired, and the Soviets now had 2 strong armies in formerly German territory. However, the Soviets' reserves were very weak, and if the Wehrmacht could carry out successful, concentrated attacks, they could put themselves back in a strong position. Nazi Germany still had several units in position to attack the Soviets, with several more in reserve, plus an economy of 41 IPCs, second only to the United States' 42. The decision was made to continue the original plan. Germany chose to use 40 of their IPCs to build an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, a tank, and 3 artillery. Naval threats were dealt with first. 2 U-boats from Sea Zone 9 were sent to Sea Zone 11 to hunt the transports off the American coast. In German waters, the U-boats in Sea Zone 5 were deployed to Sea Zone 7, where they were reinforced with fighters from Norway and northwestern Europe, and a bomber from Germany. In the Mediterranean, the battleship off the coast of Italy was sent to Sea Zone 14, reinforced by a fighter from Poland. Finally, a fighter from Bulgaria, Romania, and a fighter from Germany flew to Sea Zone 17, targeting the British destroyer patrolling the waters. These attacks would surely destroy most of the Allied Navy in the Atlantic, but came at the cost of leaving no Luftwaffe units available for the offensive against the Soviets. It would be up to the Wehrmacht to decide this fight. First, Germany sent all of their units from Belorussia, Finland, and the Baltic states into Karelia, with 2 infantry from Germany conducting an amphibious assault via the transport in Sea Zone 5. This force, designated Army Group North, would undoubtedly annihilate the Soviet defenders. However, they remained vulnerable to attack from West Russia, as well as the fighters from Russia and the tanks from the Ukraine. To reduce this threat as much as possible, all units from Poland and Bulgaria, Romania, as well as 2 tanks from Germany, were sent into the Ukraine. This force, designated Army Group South, faced a more evenly matched opponent than their northern counterparts. German High Command was, however, still confident in victory. With all their units moved, it was time to go to battle. First, off the coast of the United States, the 2 U-boats played a long game of cat and mouse with the U.S. destroyer, as roll after roll resulted in no hits. Eventually, however, the destroyer came out on top, sinking both submarines without taking any hits. The Allies off the British coast were not so lucky. The U-boat scored one initial hit, damaging the Royal Navy's battleship before it even knew what was happening. From there, the Luftwaffe scored two more hits, putting both the battleship and the transport under the waves for good. Before going down, however, the battleship was able to take out a U-boat, and the Soviet submarines slipped quietly into the water, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Off the coast of Algeria, the German battleship sank the British cruiser, only enduring some repairable damage in return. The destroyer in Sea Zone 17 did, however, manage to put up a fight. Dodging the fighters' initial attacks, the destroyer managed to take out one of the fighters before being sunk itself. On land, Army Group North overwhelmed the defenders in Karelia, losing only 2 infantry in return, and firmly placing both the Soviet factory and the victory city of Leningrad under German control. Army Group South saw far less success. Their first roll only gave them 3 hits, as opposed to the defenders' 4. Their second roll did manage to eliminate the remaining Soviet tanks, but not before taking a hit in return, leaving only 3 German tanks to occupy Ukraine. With combat concluded, a large gap had formed between the Germans' front and their reinforcements. In response, all available German armor units were moved to Poland, along with the lone infantry in Germany. The fighters in Sea Zone 7 flew back to Norway, and the bomber returned to Germany. The fighters in Sea Zone 14 and 17 were flown to the Italian coast, awaiting deployment of the carrier. A debate amongst German high command briefly took place over whether the forces in Italy and southern Europe should be sent east, or if 2/3 should be transported to North Africa. It was ultimately decided that the Africa campaign was still viable, and the infantry from Italy and artillery from southern Europe were sent to Libya, while the infantry from southern Europe marched on to Bulgaria-Romania. With all movements completed, Germany deployed their fresh units. The aircraft carrier was built in Sea Zone 15, taking aboard the 2 fighters waiting off the coast. The destroyer was placed in Sea Zone 5. The naval force just off the coast of Germany was small, but if they could add even 1 unit to it each turn, Germany would have a considerable force to deter Allied landings. The remaining land units were all placed in Germany, destined for the Eastern Front. For the time being, the North African front would not be receiving any more reinforcements. While West Russia remained under Soviet control, the occupation of Karelia SSR kept the German IPC count at 41. It also moved the total of Axis-controlled victory cities up to 7, meaning only 3 more stood between them and total victory. Moving on to the United Kingdom's turn, the British Empire was staying true to Churchill's promise to never surrender. Across the globe, almost every territory of the Empire was at risk of invasion. Arguably their strongest asset, the Royal Navy, had been almost completely wiped out in the Atlantic, and stood little chance in the Pacific against the IJN. If the Crown was going to stand a chance against Nazi tyranny, they would need to rebuild their Atlantic fleet. With their 31 IPCs, they would build 3 infantry to be deployed from India, and an aircraft carrier and destroyer bound for the Atlantic. Not only would the British need to strengthen the Royal Navy, they would need to disrupt as much of the Axis navies as possible. In the Atlantic, a sortie of 2 fighters and a bomber from the United Kingdom would attack the German fleet in the Baltic Sea. The destroyer off the coast of Canada would also sail to Sea Zone 7, hunting down the 1 remaining German U-boat. In the Pacific, the British focused on eliminating the Japanese carrier strike group in Sea Zone 37. All combat naval units from Sea Zone 35, Sea Zone 39, and the fighter from Egypt would participate in the first carrier battle of the game. With nearly evenly matched forces, the outcome would be 50-50, with the potential for absolute catastrophe. However, destroying the carrier strike group would be a huge win for the Allies' Pacific campaign, and would pave the way for an invasion of the economically vital East Indies. With this possibility in mind, 2 Indian colonial infantry and 2 Australian infantry were loaded onto transports and sent to the island. The stage was set. First, in the Baltic Sea, the Royal Air Force managed to destroy the German fleet in 2 rolls, taking only 1 hit in return. The British opted to take the hit on their bomber rather than a fighter, so both fighters could land on the carrier once built, providing more defense against a possible Luftwaffe counterattack. Off the United Kingdom's coast, another game of cat and mouse was played between the destroyer and the U-boat, with the destroyer coming out on top after a whopping 16 rolls. In just 2 attacks, more than half of the Kriegsmarine was destroyed. Things were looking up for the Royal Navy, with even more successes in the Pacific. On their first roll, the Australian submarine managed to hit a surprise strike on the Japanese battleship, followed by 3 more hits from the fighters and cruisers. The IJN only responded with 3 hits. By the second round, only 1 Japanese fighter was left to face a full British carrier force. The fighter was promptly shot down, taking a British fighter with it. The seas now clear, the Indian and Australian infantry landed on the shores of the East Indies, taking on 2 Japanese infantry occupying the island. The campaign was long and brutal. It took 6 turns, with the British losing 2 infantry before the island was liberated. By the end of their combat move, the British were sitting in a very comfortable position. Both the Germans and Japanese had taken considerable hits with acceptable British losses. The Empire would now move to secure its position as best it could. The infantry in South Africa was advanced into Rhodesia. The infantry in the Transjordan crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt. The infantry in Persia was sent to the Transjordan, and the remaining Indian infantry was sent to reinforce the infantry in Burma. In the Atlantic, the 2 fighters in the Baltic Sea returned to Sea Zone 7, being joined by the transport from Sea Zone 10. Finally, the Canadian tank in eastern Canada and the Canadian infantry in western Canada were sent to Alaska, reinforcing the American infantry against a possible Japanese invasion. The 3 infantry that were built prior were deployed to India, and the new naval units were deployed to Sea Zone 7, putting control of the North Atlantic firmly in the hands of the Royal Navy. Finally, the Empire collected 35 IPCs, increased by 4 from their starting count due to the occupation of the East Indies. The destruction of their southern carrier fleet and the loss of the East Indies had certainly not been expected nor accounted for by the Japanese. Their planned invasion of India had been significantly undermined, and now, naval forces that had initially been intended to hit the Americans around Hawaii had to be diverted to deal with the Royal Navy. Despite this, their plan for a 3-front push would remain in place. The push towards India, however, would have to be delayed. In keeping with the plan, the Japanese built a factory to be placed in Manchuria and a destroyer and transport to mobilize units from the Japanese mainland. The offensives would now take place. In the north, 3 infantry from Manchuria would cross the Soviet border, taking Buryatia SSR without incident. There they would remain, staring down Soviet forces until more reinforcements could arrive. In China, 4 infantry from Jiangsu and 1 fighter from Manchuria pushed into Anhui. Further south, the province of Yunnan would be the target of a Japanese amphibious assault. The transport off the coast of Japan would ferry an infantry and a tank to the territory, while the transport off the coast of China would take the infantry and artillery from the Philippines to Yunnan. The invasion would be supported by the battleship in Sea Zone 60 and a fighter from Japan. The IJN was extremely disappointed with the destruction of their southern force. The admirals would now have to choose which objective to pursue: destroying the American carrier and its support vessels off the coast of Hawaii, or eliminate the threat posed by the Royal Navy and their Colonial Expeditionary Force. It was unanimously agreed that the British had to be dealt with. Left alive, those transports threatened Borneo, Malaya, New Guinea, the Philippines, and even French Indochina, Thailand. Furthermore, if the carrier escaped back to the Indian Ocean, it could be reinforced with even more vessels, creating 2 naval threats in the Pacific. With Sea Zone 37 for sure a target, a plan was briefly proposed to hit both Allied navies, but was quickly dismissed. The Royal Navy needed to be eliminated. To do so, the carrier in the Caroline Islands sailed to Sea Zone 47, launching its fighter into Sea Zone 37. The destroyer from Sea Zone 61 sailed to the East Indies as well, joined by a bomber from Japan and a fighter from French Indochina, Thailand. The lone British carrier put up a gallant fight, launching its fighter and dodging all but 1 Japanese hit. The British fighter managed to sink the Japanese destroyer in return. In the second roll, each Japanese air unit scored a hit, annihilating the British fighter, but not before losing a fighter of their own. With no one left to defend them, both British transports were sunk, marooning the Indian forces on the islands. In Yunnan, the Japanese just barely managed to defeat their enemy on the first roll, scoring 1 hit from the battleship and 1 hit from the tank. The Chinese forces scored 1 hit in return, killing 1 Japanese infantry. The Battle of Anhui was a decisive Japanese victory. Both Chinese infantry were destroyed on the first round with no Japanese casualties in return. Having completed their missions, the Japanese air units returned to Japanese territories. The Japanese first turn had ended with a great amount of success. The Royal Navy had been completely annihilated in the Pacific, and the offensives on land were proceeding smoothly. Both the Soviet-Chinese border and the factory in India remained realistic objectives. The infantry in Malaya was advanced into French Indochina Thailand in preparation for an invasion of Burma. The US Navy, however, was still fully intact. In response, the IJN sailed their remaining vessels around the carrier in Sea Zone 47, creating a new carrier strike force. With all their units moved, the Japanese deployed their build. A destroyer and transport were cast off into Sea Zone 62, and a factory was built in Manchuria, ready to supply an invasion into the Soviet Union. Despite capturing the 3 territories, the loss of the East Indies led to Imperial Japan only collecting 29 IPCs, a drop of 1 from their starting amount. Moving to the New World, the United States found themselves almost completely unscathed. With the exception of China, their starting force remained intact. Coupled with an IPC count of 42, the largest economy in the game, the US undoubtedly held the rank of the most powerful nation on the board. With the majority of their fleet in the Pacific, however, the US was not yet ready to begin offensives against the Germans. Buildup would be the name of the game, preparing themselves for a Turn 2 invasion of North Africa. As such, the US built an aircraft carrier, 2 transports, a tank, and 2 artillery, almost all of which would participate in the coming offensive. While little would occur in the Atlantic, the US Navy would mobilize in the Pacific, undertaking their campaign of harassing the Japanese. Their first target would be the tiny island of Wake. While it has no IPC value, recapturing the island would give US air power a place to land when conducting operations in the Pacific, and prevent the Japanese from doing the same. A transport would take an infantry from the western United States and Midway to Wake, supported by 2 fighters from the Hawaiian Islands. The transport would be defended by the entire American Pacific Fleet, with the battleship providing naval bombardment. The minimal Japanese defenders would surely be eliminated. The assumption was correct. American naval bombardment annihilated the Japanese infantry, which scored 0 hits in defense. With combat over, the 2 fighters retreated to the deck of the nearby carrier. The US had made a statement in the Pacific, but their position was not necessarily advantageous. From Sea Zone 52, the US could strike New Guinea, the Philippine Islands, or even the Japanese mainland. That being said, attacking any of those territories would, for the time being, bring them in range of the slightly more powerful Japanese fleet. The Turn 2 movements of the IJN would determine America's next move in the Pacific. In the meantime, the invasion of North Africa was being prepared. The remaining infantry and fighter from the western United States was transferred to the east. The western fighter was joined by the fighter from the eastern United States, both awaiting the deployment of a carrier to Sea Zone 11. The cruiser from Sea Zone 19 also joined the invasion force, crossing the Panama Canal. The invasion, however, would not only be launched from the US. The lone American bomber left the mainland for the United Kingdom, positioning itself to launch sorties against Germany. Finally, the remaining forces in China were pulled back into Kazakh SSR, with the fighter being sent to defend India. The Americans deployed almost all of their build on the East Coast. In Sea Zone 11, they deployed 2 transports and a carrier, on which the 2 fighters in the Sea Zone landed. In the eastern United States, the US deployed 1 artillery and 1 tank. The one remaining build, and the only one sent to the Pacific, was an artillery piece built in the western United States. The Americans were now fully prepared for an amphibious invasion of Morocco. Having lost 2 territories in China, the US only collected 40 IPCs, putting them 1 IPC behind Germany, who now held the title of largest global power.
And with that, round 1 has come to an end. The Allies survived in very good shape, poised to strike hard next round. The Axis, however, are far from finished and could easily turn things around with a few well-placed moves. What would you have done in the player's shoes? Let us know down in the comments, and be sure to tune in next Wednesday for the second round of this playthrough. As always, be sure to subscribe to EMFX Studios for more fun, nerdy content.